Galileo discovers the moons of Jupiter. Created by Scott Jackson, directed by Scott Jackson, narrated by Scott Jackson. You get the idea. And with the help of Spitz Creative Media, who provided the side dome preview software that was used to produce this show. And special thanks to Mount Cuba Astronomical Observatory. So Galileo discovers the moons of Jupiter and something much more.
From late December to Galileo was the first person to use the newly invented telescope for astronomy. At the time it was invented, telescopes were of low power and of limited use. Galileo built his own and improved it so that it had a magnification of about 20 power, high enough to see the things we will describe tonight. With it, he observed Jupiter for many nights in 1610 through 1613. He kept careful records in a notebook that has survived through time. In his notebook are sketches and notes, the notes being in Latin or Italian. We will use the power of our digital planetarium to reproduce his observation and discover something truly amazing about what he may have seen in the early 17th century. So here we are in Wilmington, Delaware, in the 21st century, 400 years and a continent away from when and where Galileo made his observations. So we will have to travel back in time and fly to Venice, Italy. Don't worry, the flight will be free and it's a short one. So here we are. It is the early evening of January 7th, 1610, and we are in Venice, Italy. That bright object above and to the right of the moon is Jupiter. It is the second brightest object in the sky now, after the moon. Let us zoom in on Jupiter using our digital telescope. This is the view you would see with a pair of binoculars that are on a tripod. As you can see, there are 3 dots present. 2 on the left and 1 on the right. These are the moons of Jupiter. Their names are Io, Ganymede, Europa, and Callisto. Let's look at what Galileo recorded in his notebook. Remarkably, he saw the same thing. Let's zoom in a little closer using our digital telescope. Now those 2 dots on the left become 3 dots. Galileo's telescope did not have the ability to resolve 2 of the moons that were very close to each other. It is likely by this first observation that Galileo thought these dots were possibly moons. Galileo would later write, quote, "On the 7th day of January in the present year 1610, in the first hour of the following night, when I was viewing the constellations of the heavens through a telescope, the planet Jupiter presented itself to my view. And as I had prepared for myself a very excellent instrument, I noticed a circumstance which I had never been able to notice before, namely that 3 little stars, small but very bright, were near the planet, and although I believed them to belong to a number of the fixed stars, yet they made me somewhat wonder because they seemed to be arranged exactly in a straight line, parallel to the ecliptic, and to be brighter than the rest of the stars, equal to them in magnitude. We will slowly move ahead in time. This way we will see what Galileo could not, that the points of light are moving around Jupiter. Galileo looked again on the following night at 7 in the evening as in the previous night. He was taking, in effect, a second snapshot of Jupiter. Through our digital telescope, we see 3 moons on the right and one way over to the left. Galileo's telescope had a fairly small field of view, and he likely did not see the one on the left since it was out of his field of view. Also, from the previous night, he might have expected to see only 3 points of light. That is what his notebook recorded, 3 points of light to the right of Jupiter. He would later write, quote, "When on January 8th, led by some fatality, I turned again to look at the same part of the heavens, I found a very different state of things, for there were 3 little stars all west of Jupiter, and nearer together than on the previous night. I therefore concluded and decided unhesitatingly that there are 3 stars in the heavens moving about Jupiter, as Venus and Mercury around the Sun." We will again let time progress to the next observation, done on January 13th. Now the 4 moons are close to Jupiter, lined up with 3 on the right and 1 on the left. Remarkably, Galileo's sketch looks just like the simulation on the dome. This shows what a great observer Galileo was and the power and accuracy of the digital planetarium. With this third observation, Galileo likely believed that there were 4 moons, even though he called them erratic sidereal bodies. Quote, "These subsequent observations also established that there are not only 3, but 4 erratic sidereal bodies performing their revolutions around Jupiter." Galileo's observations were remarkable for such a crude telescope. His observations continued for several years and may have resulted in an even more shocking discovery. We will jump ahead to December 27th, 1612, at 15.46 hours after noon. That is, it is about 3:30 a.m. on December 28th, 1612. You can see 3 moons next to Jupiter, with Io having been lost in the face of Jupiter, which Galileo could not see. Galileo's sketch shows exactly what we see on the dome. He is now recording numbers next to the planet. The numbers shown are apparent distances in number of Jupiter diameters to each of the moons. In this way, Galileo can create a plot of the motions of the moon. An example of such a plot from Sky Telescope is shown now on the dome. In his sketches, he seems to be pointing out another star well far away from Jupiter. By this time he had improved his telescope and had a wider field of view. In the simulation, it is clear that there are several stars in his field of view. One of them is brighter and closer to Jupiter than the object he has pointed out. So why point out that object? He made another observation just before sunrise, about 4 hours later. Io is now visible 3 diameters to the right of Jupiter. But again, he pointed out that object that looked like a star. From late December to early January 1613, Galileo continued to accurately record the positions of the moons. On January 3rd, the object that he had highlighted on December 28th actually goes behind Jupiter, moving from left to right. It is not moving relative to the stars in the field of view. This suggests that it is a star. I suspect that Galileo ignores it until later in January, when it comes back into his field of view, going in the opposite direction relative to the stars. On January 28th, he notes that object again, but this time he is measuring its distance to a nearby star. he says, quote, "After fixed star A, another was following on the same line. It is B, which also was observed on the preceding night, but they seemed more remote from each other." Unquote. Here he is saying that the two stars have moved closer together compared to the night before, which is, in fact, correct. This should have told him that he had discovered a wanderer or a planet in the sky. He was, in fact, looking at Neptune. We just do not know if he recognized that he had discovered Neptune more than 234 years before anyone else. From December 1612 through January 1613, Galileo had witnessed two oppositions at nearly the same time in the same field of view of his telescope, one for Jupiter and one for Neptune. When a planet is in opposition, it is at its closest point to the Earth, and for a short time it appears motionless in the sky relative to the stars. Perhaps the lack of motion of Neptune was why he ignored it initially. Seeing two oppositions in a single telescope field of view is extremely rare. Even more rare is that Neptune was occulted by Jupiter on January 3, 1613. His sketches show that he was looking at Jupiter at the time of the occultation. It is possible that he thought it was a star that went behind Jupiter. However, by January 28th, it was clear that he was seeing that this star was moving relative to other stars. Perhaps he thought it might have been another moon. But that is unlikely, since he had been carefully observing Jupiter's 4 moons for over 2 years. It is pretty clear that Galileo was ignoring stars. Perhaps he recognized that they twinkled while the moons of Jupiter, which looked star-like, glowed like planets. Did Neptune glow? That, in its changing distance to the star on January 28th, should have convinced him that he had seen something other than a star. Could Galileo ever imagine our ability to go back and recreate his observations? Did Galileo believe he had discovered another planet? Galileo would send scrambled sentences, anagrams, to his colleagues to establish his priority for the discoveries he had made with his new telescope. He discovered the phases of Venus, the rings of Saturn, and mountains on the moon. Perhaps somewhere he wrote an as yet undecoded anagram that reveals he knew he had discovered a new planet. Galileo was a strong supporter of a sun-centered solar system, or Copernican model. His publications of the observations of the mountains on the moon, where the moon was supposed to be smooth, of the phases of Venus, and the moons of Jupiter provided physical evidence that it was a sun-centered solar system. He observed many objects that did not go around the Earth. A sun-centered solar system conflicted with the teachings of the Catholic Church at the time, namely that the Earth was the center of the universe and that everything revolved around it. This caused Galileo to be put under permanent house arrest for heresy. In 1992, Pope John Paul II officially absolved Galileo of his crimes against the Church 350 years after his death.